Hello and welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project, and thank you so much for tuning in. I always appreciate that. And today's guest is a lovely young lady. Her name is Chelsey Brooke Cole, and she is a trauma-informed psychotherapist, speaker, author, and coach specializing in narcissistic abuse and relational trauma. She is also the author of the recently published book titled If I'd Only Known: How to Outsmart Narcissists, Set Guilt-Free Boundaries, and Create Unshakable Self-Worth. She is also currently pursuing her doctorate in social psychology. Chelsey, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you, especially when you read the title of that book. My goodness, I would like to know how to outsmart narcissists. But first of all, you have to identify them. And I know you're going to explain to us how to do that. Setting guilt-free boundaries and create unshakable self-worth. Who wouldn't want that?
I hope so. Yeah. And especially if you are dealing with any kind of narcissist or toxic relationship, I feel like those two things you need, especially to protect yourself.
Absolutely. So just tell us your story, how you became interested in healing narcissism or people who are dealing with narcissistic relationships, narcissistic people. So I'm just going to say, take it away.
Sure. It's a long story, so we can break it up or feel free to ask any questions along the way. But yeah, a lot of people wonder, how do you get into something like narcissistic abuse? It's quite an interesting specialty. My journey with it really started from a young age. I described, my mom is like an empath, super compassionate. I always had a very close relationship with her growing up. So it was interesting because I had this totally secure attachment on the one side. And then on the other side, I always described my dad as cold, distant, emotionally neglectful. There really just wasn't a relationship there from the beginning. I mean, he just wasn't present. And there was, kind of this cycle of abuse going on in the home where you would feel the tension building. It was never physical abuse, but that emotional just tenseness. You could cut it with a knife. That kind of tense emotional energy, and then there would be some kind of emotional incident where promises would be made. It would all kind of come to a head. He would promise things would change and things would get better. And as a kid, I mean, you desperately want to believe that. I remember reading back in some of my journals about days that would be good and how I would be writing about, oh, I think he really does care and I think things are going to get better and I really believe him this time. And then, it would just slowly go downhill from there again. So I really grew up, with feeling familiar with that kind of cycle of hot and cold and things getting better and then things getting worse. And over the years, as most cycles of abuse do, it gets to a point where there is no quote honeymoon anymore either. Like it's all just really tense. And so that was my background. And of course that set me up, when by the time I got into dating age or, with other relationships, I was very used to feeling like I had to earn love. And so we can get into that where I had more relationships with narcissists, but that was the foundation of kind of where this started.
So when you're talking about like that, the cycle of, oh, okay, everything's going to be fine. And then it's not, and then it's fine. I was thinking it sounds just like the same as living with an alcoholic.
That's a great parallel. It is similar. I think any kind of abusive or toxic or dysfunctional home, that tends to be the environment. It's that hot and cold. It's the mix of not really being sure what kind of mood your parent will be in. I mean, later on, I remember him coming home drunk and hearing him like outside trying to fiddle with the door, like getting the key in the door because he'd been out or whatever. That wasn't so much present when I was growing up, but still the mental and emotional strain. I mean, and the difference is I saw mom on the one hand being very compassionate, trying to make things work. I would she tried to keep this from me, but I was like, as my role in the family, I was a truth teller, and I'm very intuitive, and I'm very like, what is going on here? So I knew that she would be upset, even though she tried to keep it from me. And then I saw him just being very cold and distant, like never, just that basic human interaction or empathy toward her. I just didn't see. He was very cold and distant. So for a long time, I saw that whoever had the least amount of emotion or showed the least amount of emotion was in control of the situation. So I think in order to protect me and in order to try to almost protect mom from it too, I became more stoic. I was like, you're not going to get to me. I'm not going to give you my emotions. So for a long time, I carried a lot of anger and just this very intense protective shell, growing up. And no kid should have to feel that way, in their home.
Well, you're walking on eggshells constantly because you never
Yeah.
know, and you never know what the tripwire is going to be to set
No.
somebody like that off.
Yeah. And, I describe him now, I have the language for it. I didn't at the time, but I describe him more as fitting into that neglectful narcissist category because he like a mix of a neglectful and vulnerable narcissist, because neglectful narcissists are quite cold and hollow and detached. They don't have an intense love bombing phase. They're just really neglectful all around. And then the vulnerable narcissist is always the victim, and they reel you in with sympathy and pity and attention. So that was something that was really difficult, because when someone is always playing the victim, it's hard to realize you're being victimized. Because
especially
he was,
when you're so young.
Yeah.
How would you know?
No, exactly. I had no idea. And that's what's so powerful, not in a great way, but what it makes such an impact for kids growing up in these environments is because that is normal. It's like part of you sees other families and you're like, well, they don't have these struggles, or their dad is super involved and seems nice and caring and quote normal, but that's not my experience. So you become in this weird world where I grew up theoretically knowing like good men and good families and good relationships were possible, but at the same time not really feeling like that was true for me.
Because you weren't experiencing it.
Yes. And whatever you initially grow up with, whatever feels familiar is what you're drawn to initially. There's this, in romantic relationships where it's like we're trying to win over the unwinnable parent by winning over the unwinnable partner. You just find yourself, repeating that cycle subconsciously, of course, not intentionally, but
of course.
But that's essentially, what creates that foundation for the trauma bond, where people find themselves in these relationships over and over, and they get frustrated with themselves, not understanding, they're really just trying to fix an old attachment wound or those old traumas.
So I have two questions for you. And this is going back to that, that day that, you heard your dad, fumbling with his keys, trying to get in. Was there a part of you that was hoping he wouldn't be able to unlock the door and come into the house? The other question is, are you an only child? Do you have any siblings?
I am an only child. So I did not have any other siblings in the house to talk about this or try to make sense of things. It's been a while, so it's hard to remember exactly how I felt at the time, but I think I imagine just a lot of anger. I carried a lot of anger for a long time, and I pushed that into being super successful and busy. I was in what we would call the flight of the 4Fs, the trauma response: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. I was in my flight mode a lot, trying to be productive, trying to be successful. There was a big part of me that felt like I needed to protect myself, be able to provide for myself, be very self-sufficient. That kind of led me to starting college at 16. I had my master's at 22. I started working full-time as a therapist, and that's what I've been doing since then. So,
wow.
Yeah, I've been kind of busy.
Yeah, overachiever. Okay, so let's go back to the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, because I've heard before, of course, fight, flight, freeze, or bite as the fourth one, but I've never heard freeze or fawn. So address the fawn. Does that mean, what does that mean?
That is the people pleasing. So if you find yourself, feeling very uncomfortable with any tense conflict or situation, like it's so uncomfortable for you to experience the tension or the possible conflict that you sometimes avoid it at all costs. You just figure out, what does this person want? What does this person need? You find yourself being quite hypervigilant, walking on eggshells, just trying to make peace. And that can, of course, kind of almost strengthen the trauma bond or keep toxic relationships together, unfortunately. And a lot of people stuck in a fawn response feel that mix of shame too. Like, why am I doing this? I know that I want to get out of this relationship, but I'm so uncomfortable with the conflict that I just keep figuring out what this person wants and I just give it to them. So it's really about you trying to meet your need for safety. It's not so much that you want to give the narcissist or toxic person what they want. It's that you want to feel safe, and you learn that meeting other people's needs is the only way to do that.
Mm-hmm. So let's go down this little rabbit hole too, because of what you're describing with all of this tension, all of this pressure, constantly being under that hypervigilance. Of course, this sets you up for PTSD.
Yeah.
And that's why I call it, because I called, I have an experience with PTSD, and I used to refer to it, and I still do. It was like falling down a rabbit hole. And, you keep tumbling down this rabbit hole, and there's nothing to hang on to. There's nothing to break your fall. There's nothing to stop it. And you know that at the bottom of that pit is this great big carnivorous rabbit with great big gnashing teeth just waiting for you to devour you. That's what it felt like for me.
Yeah, that's a great description. I think I definitely lived a lot of my life in that feeling survival mode, what we call fight or flight, just trying to avoid the bottom from falling out. And I felt that was inevitable, that was going to happen. And then, of course, in my adult romantic relationships, I've had other relationships with narcissists as well, but I think romantic ones made the biggest impact. That's where I just kept repeating that process of trying really hard to make these relationships work when I should have just been listening to my gut and seeing the signs and like listening to myself and getting out of them. I just doubled down and thought I need to make this work. So I think that's how it showed up in my life for a long time.
So you mentioned other narcissistic relationships, including romantic ones. Are you saying that you've actually had friendships, with female friends or whatever that ended up being narcissists?
Yeah, I think some of those as well. Some work relationships, some friendships, because narcissists can be anywhere, right? Like we talk about it a lot as being either a parent or a partner, because we just think of those more frequently, or they're just talked about more. But absolutely, I think my most influential ones were in romantic relationships, but I have seen and I've experienced the narcissists in workplace and friendships and other family members as well.
It's interesting because I did not realize how prevalent narcissism was. And it's really interesting because I told you earlier before we started recording that I recently posted an interview with a woman, I think she's from Australia, yes, who was raised by a narcissistic mother. So I just posted it. And somebody, a friend of mine, responded and said, wow, I had to look the word up. I didn't even know what a narcissist was and didn't, the relationships. And I responded to him and I said, interestingly enough, I'm talking to another young woman today who had a similar experience. So, I think it's a really wonderful thing that you're doing to shed light on this subject, because I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this might, a light bulb might come off for them or go off, because they understand there's something wrong with their relationship, but they can't figure out what it is.
Yeah. And that's exactly where most people start. The first sign you're usually aware of when you're dealing with a narcissist or toxic person is changes in your thinking. You start ruminating a lot, trying to make sense of things. Like if you haven't had a relationship like this, it's something that you've never experienced before. It just doesn't make any sense. And all of the healthy communication strategies that people tell you to use, they don't work, they backfire. You experience a lot of cognitive dissonance that where your reality and your expectations don't match up. Like, for example, if you're married to someone you expect to be able to rely on and communicate with and receive love from them, when you're married to someone and they're cold and critical or contemptuous or passive aggressive, we're really uncomfortable with that disparity. And that anxiety that we experience is really uncomfortable. That's part of the cognitive dissonance. So what do? We try to alleviate those anxious symptoms by justifying and rationalizing and explaining, looking for something to make this make sense. And if you haven't yet realized you're dealing with a narcissist, then you think there is a solution. You think we're just miscommunicating, or we just have different love languages, or we just have different attachment styles. If we could just figure this out and make it work, we can get to a good place. And because you can never get there, you end up feeling like there's something wrong with you.
So at what point did you realize that you had this, you were abused by a narcissist, and that you were in this cycle of being attracted to narcissists? And I'm not saying, you know, intentionally, because again, the pattern was there. And I think it's not necessarily to say that you were attracted to them, but I think that narcissists, like predators of any type, know who would be easy to manipulate.
Sure. Yeah. Because they're looking for people who are everything they're not, who are kind and empathetic and generous and giving, who believe in second chances, who I think a pitfall for me was that I saw people's potential so much. And as a therapist, I think that's been really helpful. Like I see where people can get to and I believe in them and I provide that hope and encouragement to them. But in a romantic relationship or someone who's just going to exploit that, that became really dangerous. So it was a process, honestly, to get to, because like I said, I dealt with different types of narcissists. And I know that's a whole nother topic we could get into. But like I said, dad was more of that neglectful, vulnerable type. I think initially I looked for someone on the surface who was very different than that. Like I was trying to protect myself by finding someone who was very different because I knew neglectful and cold, you know, I had been raised in that. I didn't want that. So I went like the other way and found a more grandiose narcissist who's, you know, talkative and extroverted. And we spent a lot of time together. So he wasn't neglectful in the emotional sense, but was very manipulative. So he was just on the opposite end of the spectrum. Lots of lying, lots of hiding things, lots of contemptuous comments. So you know, that was another, I guess, a layer to my journey of understanding like, oh, it's not just about their initial presence or their demeanor. You really have to look for these patterns of behavior. And a big thing I had to pay attention to is how I felt. And that's something I talk about in my book of how do you recognize a narcissist based on how you feel? Because so much of our warning signs are body-based. It's our intuition. It's us looking back and going, oh, I knew in my gut, something told me this relationship wasn't right. Even if they checked all the boxes and they looked really nice and they presented well, there was something about them that I just felt was off, but I didn't listen to it. So I actually worked, you know, kind of walk people through what are the signs you should be looking for and how do you feel differently when you're around a toxic person versus when you're around a healthy person. So that was something that I ended up paying attention to a lot as well, that even though I was dealing with a neglectful narcissist initially and then a more grandiose narcissist, how I felt was a lot the same, which is you end up feeling not enough no matter what relationship you're in.
Wow. I can go on so many tangents. So many things sparked in my little brain right now. I think I might just share that with you when we're off camera. But I don't know. I haven't decided yet. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, and this is really, really important, and I really want the listeners to pay very close attention to this because it's a word that we hear a lot, but I'm not sure if we fully understand it, especially when you're talking about narcissistic people. And that is grooming and the process of grooming and how they lure you in. It's very insidious.
It is. Yep. I describe narcissistic abuse as it happens so subtly that the changes or the insecurities you're experiencing, you think are you instead of what's happening to you. Because by the time you realize that you're with a narcissist or toxic person, the damage is already done. So it is definitely super insidious. What we talk about as far as how do narcissists draw us in, there's many different layers we could talk about, but let's talk about narcissistic supply, because that's something we hear a lot of times. And that too can look very different depending on what type of narcissist you're dealing with. Grandiose narcissists, more malignant or communal narcissists, which are the philanthropists, the humanitarians who are, being seen in almost a saint-like way, but they're doing it for the praise that they expect to get. Those types of narcissists seek supply in the sense of the admiration, attention, validation. You might feel pulled into this type of person because they are very charming and charismatic, and they can be extroverted and seem very socially adept. And some people describe it, especially when you get sucked into this kind of relationship romantically, you describe it as the best thing ever, like the best relationship you've ever been in, because a narcissist is kind of data mining you. I've heard it described that way before. They are looking for what's important to you. They're learning about you. They create this very intense, tell me about you. What are your goals? What are your dreams? What are your hopes? Tell me about your childhood. And you are thinking that you are building true intimacy, that you're creating an authentic relationship, and you're sharing, and you're like, oh, this is amazing. And it's so, intense, and we're sharing and we're going on levels I've never been on with other people. But a narcissist isn't creating true intimacy. They're gathering information to then slowly use against you later, and to learn what insecurities you have, what vulnerabilities you have, so that they can slowly break you down in those areas.
Wow. You're right. They're data mining.
Yeah.
Okay. So is that a clue then? If somebody meets somebody that you meet somebody you're dating that you're over the moon, they're just wonderful, and that you feel like, just so honored and loved, you feel like a princess, whatever.
Yeah.
Is this actually a warning sign?
It is something we should be paying attention to, because toxic relationships tend to develop much quicker and more intensely than healthier relationships. Healthy relationships take time to grow. You start with more basic information, just getting to know each other. It's kind of like you're taking a we'll see approach. Like, yeah, I think that date was good. We'll see. We're just getting to know each other. It feels much more it's a slower process. Toxic narcissistic relationships tend to be very intense very quickly. So if you feel super infatuated with somebody, or someone is telling you very quickly, I love you, I want to be with you, this is the most amazing relationship I've ever had, you're just so incredible, I think about you all the time, and it's been a date or two, like that's something we should be paying attention to.
Slow down and proceed with caution.
Yes, that is a great, speaking of like boundaries, like that is a great boundary to have. And your partner should be respectful of that. Now, if you're dating a toxic or narcissistic person, they'll push back on that. Like, oh, you're afraid of love because your parent wasn't there for you. That's how they're using these things against you that they find out, because then they'll feed those things back to you and say, oh, you're scared to be too close because you have a hard time trusting people, or you have trust issues because of your past relationship. But don't put that on me. I'm here for you. Like, you don't know how to, really appreciate a good thing. And be very cautious if someone is trying to feed back those things you shared with them, and is pushing back on boundaries that you're trying to set.
Okay, so there's another red flag. So I'm really curious, when the narcissist is doing this and like using that information and just kind of like throwing it back at you, and this is why, and psychoanalyzing you, I think that's fantastic, right? When they're doing that, do they realize they're doing that, or is it just ingrained in their subconscious that it's almost like a knee-jerk reaction, or do they realize that they're being manipulative?
That's a great question. And it depends on how far up the scale of narcissism you're getting. So narcissism is a personality trait that exists on a spectrum. Someone can be a little narcissistic to highly narcissistic. And I describe it like, if you're an agreeable person, that tends to be a pretty rigid personality style. Like, we're often born more or less agreeable or more or less conscientious or more or less extroverted or introverted. Mm-hmm. If you're a very agreeable person, you don't have to think about being nice to people or being kind. You just are. Like you're just being you. Mm-hmm. And your kind of run-of-the-mill narcissist is just entitled, and they believe they deserve special treatment, and they have lots of defense mechanisms to protect their fragile core. So in a way, they are acting out of their narcissistic tendencies to manipulate you, to lie. Like their first immediate reaction is protect themselves. And if that means manipulate you, lash out to you, gaslight you, then most narcissists are just acting in accordance with, that very narcissistic personality trait.
Geez. Okay. Now you said, you're calling it the personality trait. And I even wrote that down. It's like, is it a trait or is it a disorder?
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of confusion these days, because the pushback I get from people is that, well, we shouldn't be diagnosing people by calling them a narcissist. But we're not, because narcissism is a descriptive term, not a diagnosis. It's like saying someone is extroverted, introverted, conscientious, agreeable. So there is a difference between trait narcissism and NPD, which is narcissistic personality disorder. Now, in order for someone to have that, they have to be diagnosed by a mental health professional. So they have to be going to therapy. Let's be honest, most narcissists are not going to therapy. And and the other thing, in order to meet criteria for NPD, is it has to create subjective distress or impairment. So we have to really see in that person's life that their narcissism is getting in the way in a significant, well, I'll rephrase that, is significantly impairing them in their life. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple criteria that have to be met for NPD. Mm-hmm. When I'm talking about narcissism or narcissistic abuse, I'm talking about people who are mid to high in the trait of narcissism.
Okay. Wow, that's a great explanation. And just from what you describe in just the personality trait, I would really hate to run into somebody who really did have NPD.
Oh, yes. And you will know that something is off there for sure.
Yeah, I would imagine the pathology is pretty obvious. You might not know exactly what it is, but there's something wrong.
Your gut often knows. Yep. And your gut is often telling you what your mind isn't yet willing to accept. Because like I said, narcissists create a very great image because that's how they get supply. So that's why that maintaining that positive image is so important to them.
Mm-hmm. And please, because I don't think we could emphasize this enough about listening to your gut, following your intuition. Yeah. If you feel like something isn't right, then it is not right.
Yep. And at least give yourself the space to explore that. I think that's where a lot of people get stuck, is they think, well, I have this gut feeling, but it doesn't make any sense because this person seems nice. They seem agreeable. They're getting to know me. They're being kind to me, or they're taking me on dates and they're treating me so well. Like, why is my gut feeling this? Just give yourself the space to decide not to decide. You know, if you have that gut feeling, just give yourself some time to see what else unfolds instead of dismissing that gut feeling.
I actually have my own theory about that, and that is going to be included in the next book that I'm currently writing. I do believe that, our intuition and our gut feeling is so strong, especially in women. But I think that over the years, society, the media, even friends and family, oh, you're just exaggerating. Oh, just give this guy a chance. He really is very nice. And I think that it's almost been like weaned out of us, or we've been trained to try and disregard that inner voice. And then of course, because I am a very suspicious person, why? What is the goal? And I think it's because then that takes away some of our power.
Yeah, it's almost like intuition has been viewed as this lesser than intellect. Right. There's in every culture, there's a lot of emphasis on things making sense and being logical. And because people have a harder time explaining why they have a certain gut feeling, there is a tendency, I think, to dismiss it.
And it's really interesting, even, and I was thinking about this several weeks ago, even when I was a little girl, they talked about, you heard about it a lot, women's intuition. And of course, this was in the 50s and 60s. I'm perfectly honest about how old I am. But, and of course, I was raised in an Eastern European household, and, it was almost like that women's intuition was very much respected, even by the men. And they would talk about it with reverence. Well, my wife, had this feeling. So if my wife had her gut feeling or my wife's intuition, I listened to it and I followed it. But over the years, as I got older, it was funny how things, especially as a younger woman, it was dismissed because, again, that takes away our power.
Yeah. I wish that we could get back to a place where our intuition was really respected. I think that's so essential for all kinds of things. We have to be trusting our gut.
I mean, our subconscious is so smart and so much smarter than I think the thinking brain or the rational brain. And it's definitely smarter than the people around you saying, oh, don't listen to that. You're being silly. You're being hysterical. You're making it up. Oh, come on. Yeah. That's so, everybody listen to your gut. Oh, please. And do follow it. Even if you feel like you're going to look like a little silly or feel foolish, it's much better than ignoring it.
Well, I'll give you a piece of science that actually explains this a little bit more. So the autonomic nervous system automatically scans the environment for cues of safety and danger. It's called neuroception. And it's doing this under the surface. So perception is the conscious meaning we give to events. They did this for this reason. That's a perception. Neuroception is happening in your subconscious. It's when you walk into a room and logically there's nothing going on here, but in your gut you're like, ooh, this room feels tense. Or when you're walking along at night and it seems fine, but neuroception is that part of you that rises to the surface and says, don't walk down that way. For you don't know why, but something inside of you. That's because your nervous system is literally scanning the environment for cues of safety and danger, and there's no your conscious mind doesn't have to filter through those things. It's not like, well, there's no reason. And a lot of times we talk ourselves out of what we intuitively know.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for bringing that up, especially the neuroscience behind what we're talking about. And I just want to make a point, especially for the listeners, because what Chelsey's talking about is so powerful and it can help keep us safe in so many different situations. However, that information that your subconscious is sending you, that neuroception, isn't going to be nearly as clear if you're looking at your cell phone. Or if you have so your earbuds in. Yeah, that's one of my pet peeves as a martial artist. Now I see women walking around, with their head in their cell phone. And I'm like, oh my gosh, look around, pay attention to your environment.
Yep, we're kind of shutting off that intuitive part of us because we're so distracted with other things.
So power to the people, power to the intuition, ladies. Just let's start working on paying attention to that because it's very important and it's keeping us safe. So I just wanted to ask you, Chelsey, how did you get out of the cycle of narcissism? And when did you recognize it was time to make a change?
Yeah, it's such a process, and it didn't start with my first narcissistic relationship. It took me another one, and getting to this place where I realized I would end up sacrificing my whole life for someone if I didn't stop looking at reality instead of potential. I had to see what was right in front of me instead of looking at what I thought that they could be. I really had to accept that some people don't want to change. Some people don't want to be better. That's so hard for me to wrap my mind around just as who I am. And then as a professional therapist, I made a job, a profession out of self-improvement. It's so ingrained in who I am that I, for a long time, just assumed that if someone was acting in abusive or dysfunctional ways, it was because they didn't understand what they were doing. And if they understood, they would change, because who wouldn't want to get better? So I really had to practice some radical acceptance that some people don't want to get better and some people don't want to change. And that was both heartbreaking and very freeing at the same time.
I love that, radical acceptance. Wow. That's a powerful phrase.
It's, we really have to get to that in toxic relationships, because you will wear yourself out if you don't just accept what is happening and that it's not your fault.
So once you got to that point, did you feel a lot lighter?
Yeah. And I had to decide, I'm going to be single for the rest of my life unless I find someone who I can really feel safe with. Like I just had to get to this point where this is who I am. This is what I want. This is what I know I need in a relationship. And that's the place I had to move forward from.
And you did find someone.
I did. Yes. And he's wonderful and great and everything I could hope for. So it is possible to get out of that cycle.
And I'm sure he's very proud of you.
He says so. That's what he says. I don't give myself a lot of credit. So he'll slow me down sometimes and say, like, you're doing a lot. You're doing good. And that means a lot.
Excellent. Okay. Now, what in the world made you decide to write a book?
It's something I've been thinking about for a long time. I decided to write the book because I know that there's still a lot of misinformation out there about narcissism and narcissistic abuse. I really wanted to make sure that anyone who doesn't have access to therapy or coaching with someone who specializes in this, they need something to start their healing journey. And I know narcissistic abuse in particular can be so isolating, and you literally feel like you're going crazy. Like you were saying, a lot of times when we're in these relationships, we get feedback like, what's wrong with you? This person seems so nice. Why can't you make this work? Are you really sure that you're seeing what you're seeing? Because I've never seen them act that way. So I really wanted to try to condense as much as possible my therapy and coaching process and put it into book form.
Wow.
So that people can take this and literally set the foundation for what a narcissist is. How did it impact you? And then how can you experience post-traumatic growth too?
I just like, I get so angry when I hear that about, people dismissing.
Yeah.
If that can't happen and, you're making it up and come on, just give them another chance. Or maybe you should be a better spouse or be a better girlfriend.
Yep.
Whoa, that just gets my blood boiling. Oh,
yep. And especially I hear that a lot in religious and spiritual spaces. You need to be a forgiving person. And as a spiritual person myself, that was used against me a lot in relationships. My past relationship in particular was a lot of spiritual abuse too. And I find that just so particularly devastating to your sense of self and sense of self-worth. And so I want help people to wrap their mind around that too. Like boundaries don't make you a bad person. And that's why I really want to talk a lot in my book about how did your family of origin impact your boundary development and what you thought you could and couldn't do and things you could and couldn't say. I really wanted to help people explore that as well and to realize that, you can be a good person and say no.
Wow. Again, I'm all, it's like a cat. Yeah. My hair is just standing on end. Okay. So give us again the title of the book, because I absolutely love it. And I love the subtitle.
It's called If Only I'd Known: How to Outsmart Narcissists, Set Guilt-Free Boundaries, and Create Unshakable Self-Worth. And I decided to go with If Only I'd Known because I can't tell you how many clients, survivors I hear say that. Because once you get it, once you see the information, you can't unsee it. And that's why I'm so passionate about helping people understand what narcissism is in all its different forms. So I talk about 6 different types of narcissists. So you're, bound to see it no matter which type of narcissist you're dealing with. Because once you see it, that's when you can start taking your power back. That's when you can realize, oh, this isn't me. This isn't something I can change because this isn't something I'm doing, which the narcissist is trying to convince you of.
Okay, now this is kind of out there in left field, but I'm curious, can a relationship with a narcissistic person be rehabilitated? Is that a possible thing?
Depends on what you mean by can it be rehabilitated, like at what level,
Okay, because the narcissist would actually have to recognize their pattern.
Yes.
For them to be able to change it. And from what I'm hearing and understanding in my own mind, and I'm actually even thinking about 2 people, is that they don't think there's anything wrong with them.
To a narcissist, if you have a problem with the way that they're treating you, then that is literally your problem. So unless or until a narcissistic person says, I'm a narcissist and here's what I do, and like they do the deep dive and they go to therapy on their own. It's not a oh, what's the word? Ultimatum you give them. It is something that they choose. And even then, realistic expectations. You are not going to take someone who is mid to high narcissist or mid to high in the trait of narcissism and make them a super agreeable, empathetic person who's no longer entitled, who no longer dismisses you or criticizes you. Just not going to happen.
And you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but I'm really curious what the relationship is with you and your dad at this point in your life.
We haven't talked in several years. I'm not sure how long.
Okay.
I have actually reached out. The last conversation we had was me. My mom and dad were actually going through a divorce at the time, and I reached out to him, trying to kind of talk some sense into him and be like, "Hey, can we be reasonable through this?" And I said, "Let me know. Like, I'll meet you. I'll have a conversation. Just can we make something work of this, where you're not just being a total jerk throughout this process?" And then I haven't heard from him since, except for a few times that he messages me, because I have him blocked on social media. He'll message me from other like unknown anonymous sources and reach out to me on my birthday recently, well, a couple years ago, to say, "Hey, hope you had a good birthday. I have some news for you, some health concerns. We need to talk. It's something that might impact you." I'm like, are you serious? And he wouldn't tell me what it was on the message.
Oh, of course not, because he's reeling you in. Of course,
right.
He's reeling you in.
Right. So I see it for what it is now, and I just don't respond.
Excellent. Okay. I just wondered what happened there.
Yeah,
I'm glad to know sure that your mom divorced him.
Yeah. Well, he's, with his affair partner, and they're doing their own thing. So, she's went through a lot herself. And that was another journey of me seeing what she has went through. And she's still on her healing journey. So it's been, narcissism has ripple effects on so many people.
Oh, yeah. Well, I wish her well. I'm sure she's a lovely person.
Thank you. She is.
Okay, so where can people find you? How can they get a hold of you? I want you to give us all the information, where they can find your book, how they can connect with you, how they can get your services. So just tell us all of that. Of course, all of the links and everything are in the show notes forever and ever, but I'd really like for you to be able to share that information.
Yeah, so I have a really active community on Facebook. You can find me there at Chelsey Brooke Cole. I'm also on Instagram and LinkedIn and TikTok. I'm also on Twitter at Chelsey B. Cole. And if anybody wants my resources, I actually send out a free bi-monthly newsletter on healing from narcissistic abuse. You can find that at my website and my book at chelseybrookecole.com.
Okay, excellent. And boy, you really do have an active community. You have so many followers. I just think it's absolutely wonderful to see the community that you have built, in on all of your sites, actually.
They're a wonderful community. Yeah.
Well, and you provide incredible content as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I just really want people to know that they're not alone in this, and to feel that they have someone daily, they can get some support from.
Excellent. Well, Chelsey, thank you so much for being here on the
show
today. I've loved talking to you and listening to you. And my goodness, I have learned a lot.
Well, good. I hope it's helpful.
Well, it's going back in time. I live here in Denver. And I'm originally from a small steel town in Western Pennsylvania. And I ended up leaving my home just a few days after, pardon me, graduating college. And it was mostly to get away from a guy who would not take no for an answer. He had already had my entire life planned.
Oh.
Yeah, I thought that was very nice. But didn't ask me about it. And then when I found out, I was like, okay, this isn't going to work. And then I tried to break up with him. He wouldn't take no for an answer. And it was like, okay, so I just moved to Denver.
Yeah. So there's not respecting your boundaries whatsoever.
Yeah. And I didn't realize until listening to you, he was a narcissist.
Sounds like there were some traits going on there for sure. Something. Yeah.
Well, thank you again for being here. Sorry, my throat is just giving out on me now. But thanks again for being on the show. I think you're wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Everybody, thank you for listening. And please do share this episode with everybody you know, because I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of narcissists lurking around that you don't even know about. So just to keep yourself safe, to be able to set strong boundaries, clear boundaries, and just to take your power back. And that is the way of the FemiNinja.